Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on renewable energy can solve global energy challenge. You know that country like Bangladesh, India, we have lot of energy related problem, and renewable energy is one of the way that we can solve any problem. Besides that, I want to share a good news that World Talent Economy Forum, we are collaborating with, it's called Lokhipur, a small city of Bangladesh, and we are uplifting the whole city with urban planning, policy developments, as well as we are developing project like solars and cities and everything. So hopefully, what we learn from today's sessions, I'm sure our parliament members and all of the valuable person they will join as an audience for today's session, and definitely we will take more actions. 15th of this month, we have very important collaboration with the city. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. First, I would like to give chance Mr. David Schumacher.
Yeah, hello, Sharif and everyone else. So the question today, can renewable energy can solve energy challenges? So there's a lot to say there, I think, just in that title. If the question is, can renewable energy solve that, then I think for the near term, the answer is no. I'll start with that. I think for the long term, well, that's a different discussion. We can talk a little bit about that too. The reason I say no is as I look around trying to see how much renewable energy is in use in various places, the statistics that I see from various sources like Al Jazeera, reporting sources in Europe, reporting sources in the US, maybe globally, renewable energy is somewhere around 20-30% of the energy that's used. The other 80% or so is all from fossil fuel. So with that thought in mind, that says that we've got some ways to go. I mean, in Europe, about 20% of their energy is from renewables. And then when I looked into countries closer to your area, Dr. Sharif, Bangladesh is down around 3% or so. And that figure is as of May 12th, 2022. Malaysia, which we talk about, is even less. So there's good news and bad news there. The good news is everybody has started. And the bad news is it takes development, time, energy, money to move these forward. There's some good examples, like in Europe, even though the European average is low, you've got some individual countries that have very high adoption of renewables. Sweden leads the way, reporting up to 60% of their energy in renewables, and Finland, Latvia, down in the 40s somewhere. So you can see by looking around the globe that it's a real uneven situation, and it can be uneven for a lot of different reasons. I mean, say what are renewables that are readily available in your area, hydroelectric, for example, and some other things that have been around long before the push, I think, for renewables. And how well can we leverage those? And what are the opportunities in the countries that have low adoption of renewables? I see interest everywhere I look. That's a positive sign. But to go back and answer the original question is, can it solve it? In the near term, I would still say no. So I think we need to look at why we want renewables and what we can do about that. Are there other non-renewable sources that we can bring in that perhaps are cleaner than what we're currently using in the fossil fuel environment? How are those doable? Are they doable economically, politically, and so forth? So I think we need some kind of supplement. Another thing too is that many times when we say, can renewables do this, I see that the idea of renewables is pretty much a zero-sum equation. We need to renew because we don't have more. We're going to run out, that sort of thing. And of course, there's truth to that. But when we look at a zero-sum situation, is there a way to make it an open system? So perhaps there are some possibilities for open systems, but those too are in the future. So open systems might be beaming energy from space. Open systems might be, well, you could say that fusion would be open system, and we've had some recent breakthroughs in fusion. Maybe asteroid mining and production in space. Those things are still in the distant future. We need something to take us from where we are now to where we want to be. And I have some ideas on that, but I'm going to save them for the next round. Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you. Now I request Professor David Smith.
Sharif, thank you. And David, the open system is a great place to go and look as you're looking at these. But let me just step back 1 minute and kind of say, really, what are renewable energy systems and where do they come from? So one of them we hear a lot about is solar energy. And, solar energy comes from the sun, and it is essentially carbon free. Yeah, some pollution is created during the manufacturing process, and once you have to dispose of the solar panels, they do create problems. The problems of those are still pretty big, but it is for many of the renewable sources right now. And in solar energy, you see it a couple of different places. You see it on large solar farms, which are usually set up around cities and others. And increasingly, you see solar panels on business rooftop, factories, on residential rooftops. And this is really helping you begin to move towards microgrids and mini grids too, in many of those installations when combined with appropriate storage technologies and others. Some of the other type of renewable sources are wind power and the big turbine farms and everything else. It's expected, though, particularly with offshore, that wind power will become more common. But there's some challenges with that as well. We have seen, for example, here in Texas, that we have a lot of wind mills working, but the ones we have here were not suited for freezing temperature because it rarely does that here. Same thing, some of the windmills up in the northern parts of the United States are having problems when it's hot up there because they were designed to work in cold climates. And one of the unexpected consequences of windmills is that they end up killing tens of thousands of birds, particularly on migratory paths. And this one surprises me. The number of small planes that have hit windmill blades and crashed is higher than I thought it would ever be. So you see that as some of the difficulties around windmills and wind power. I'm going to kind of divert here just for 1 second and say energy storage is a real important consideration with all of this. While it's not a source of energy itself, it has to be used with many different areas. And you see it from many different ways, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But renewable energy just isn't limited to these. Geothermal plants are a great way to gather heat from the earth, produce steam, and produce electricity. Hydroelectric dams, if you look in Europe, a lot of hydroelectric power there is generated from the water there. Same in China. You see hydrokinetic technologies, which are harnessing the power of oceans, currents, and waves. You see bioenergy, particularly the burning of biomass, which has many different others. And yes, you then see the rise of the more nuclear power, the fusion power, and others, which have been mentioned as being important there. Sharif, can you bring up the slides just before 1 minute? And this is kind of looking a little bit broader at what we see in renewable power. The China and the United States are really pretty far ahead when you look at renewable power as a percentage of what they're doing and how it can work. But trying to get it even better, this is looking at the share of low carbon resources and their role in the generation. And why did my legend come off of it? The top green one, heavy green one, is nuclear power and how it has ebbed and flowed and is coming back up. The bottom one here is hydroelectric. The light green is hydroelectric. And then the lower blue one is solar power, and the dark blue one here is wind power. So you can see that these are the low carbon sources from back in 1971 through 2021, and see how they've ebbed and flowed over the time. But very much so, you can see that there is an upward trend that really began back around 2017 and increasing through today. And just to look at where the global energy storage market is you can see transportation, which is the bottom one, is really the vast market leader when you look at where watt hour kilogram are going for energy storage. And this is a new study that just came out, and you can see through 2030 it is the fastest growing, and then stationary sources are the second one. I'm actually surprised with this figure from what we just said. I thought with the growth of microgrids, with the growth of solar power, with the growth of wind power, and particularly the growth of solar power and wind power in cities and at homes, this orange line would be higher. And I think it's probably a problem with this forecast, but those are the storage marketplaces. And this is just looking at the grid-related deployments by region. And what's, again, just trying to look here and see, you can see quite a bit of growth going through China. You see a bunch of growth in the US. If I look at Asia, which is really the yellow one, it's picking up speed, not as much as I thought would be there. But then the rest of the world has quite a bit picking up as well, too. So just kind of looking there, this is where you're going to see the global renewable energy grids being deployed and how much watt hours a kilogram you're going to see being produced at them with both the storage and the generation side. And finally, this is just one going back, and this is not a new chart, but an old chart I had. And this is looking at capacities. But if you look at biomass, geothermal, hydro, the wind onshore, the wind offshore, the solar, and the CSP, they all have been seeing places where, for the most part, going up. And you're going to see those, I think, continue to go. One of the big places where we've seen wind power pick up is more offshore in the last 5 years, as some of the environmental concerns for birds and wildlife have lessened there over the concerns for climate warming. And you're going to see that. The one big hit from this is biomass has taken off, and geothermal. I know personally of over probably 30, 35 geothermal projects that are going on right now. And we're, once again, it's not on this chart, but we're seeing a renewed emphasis in nuclear type of power generation, because it is a long-term power generation with minimal climate change impacts. So just to get us started here, those are some of the different types and some of the trends that we've seen on those different types going there. So I love to have data and wanted to share some of the data with you on these different types.
Thank you, Professor Rob.
That's good.
Well, going back to what David Schumacher said, the ability to use renewable energy sources to replace current energy sources near term is a non-player. The problems are storage and transport to a large extent. We don't have good storage, good energy storage. It's terribly wasteful, and most of the renewable energy methods that we're talking about aren't 24/7. So you have to have wind tends to run from late afternoon to early evening, solar only when the sun's out. The things that do run 24/7, like wave power, and that's ocean wave power, and geothermal, have huge transport problems because you have to you can't distribute the plants. You have to centralize the plants, and you have to transport out. Same thing with nuclear power. You lose a lot of power on transport. So unless you go to micro generators, which has been discussed, microgrids, and bringing the generators down in size, the plants down in size, and distributing them around the environment. You have that problem with transport loss, and so as you're bringing in another power or energy source, one of the first things you have to look at is look at the things that cause waste. The big issue with solar power, with the two big ones with solar power, it's good on the good side. It's getting cheaper. On the bad side, solar generates DC power, not AC power, which means you have to have an inverter. And the inverter robs something like 40% of the power yield out of a panel, which is problematic. It's just wasted power. It's not going to anything. It's the cost you're paying to convert from DC to AC in an inverter, and so that becomes a serious problem. And as you try to scale that out, then you have that problem with storage. I've got solar on my own home. Getting the Tesla batteries to allow the home to go off grid has proven problematic because the batteries are in short supply, and I've been waiting 2 years, 2 years for my batteries. Hopefully, we'll get them this summer. The solar plant went in last summer, summer before last, and the cost isn't cheap. I mean, when you're dropping in a solar capability for a home, you're probably talking about $50,000 to $60,000 initial spend on the panels, and another $20,000 to $40,000 spend on the batteries, which will eventually wear out and have to be replaced. That's all cost, and it's a significant cost for the homeowner. Often it's subsidized by government. But you still have to think about the creation and disposal of those damn batteries, and so the issues we have to address to turn renewable energy into a viable replacement for existing energy sources are significant. And now they can be done. Nothing that says you can't do it eventually, but I do think the focus needs to be a little bit less on generation and a little bit more on the issues we have with transport and storage. One of the most efficient ways to generate power in a renewable fashion is wave energy. The water is far denser than air. Waves go 24/7, and waves generate because they use generators. They can generate AC power, not DC power. So you don't have that problem with the power converters, the transformers. The end result is that some of the best stuff that we could use, the fusion power plants, which are looking very promising, geothermal, which are looking very promising, has always looked very promising, 24/7, very environmentally friendly, virtually no waste. The issue is back to transport. You have to find a way to get these things down so you're not having to ship the energy over long distances. So focus, and we haven't really made much in terms of advancing transport. We're working on storage. The way we store at scale, and we've had some really creative ways. Using mines, old vacant mines, to pump water up and then use that water to flow back down to generate power. So you pump the water up when you're generating power, and then the water flows down through a generator when you're not generating power. But you still get a rather substantial amount of power loss. Okay, and you're pumping water up and down for no particular purpose. Another is weight. The outfit was looking at using train tracks going up on tall mountains. The train, electric powered, would while you're generating, would go up the mountain with a lot of weight, and then would come down the mountain generating power using gravity again. When you weren't generating, well, yeah, how many people have mountains near them? So it's an interesting idea, but it would be more interesting if you were actually doing something with those trains other than just pointlessly lifting stuff up and down to generate and store power. So the big issue we've got to address with renewable energy is energy. At least from my mind, is energy storage, efficient energy storage, and then it makes a lot of these things far more viable than they are. If you can store energy and get a nominal energy loss in that storage, and what you can do with fuel. With fuel, you've got that advantage. You're moving gas. There's virtually, other than a little bit of evaporation, depending on how you seal the tanks, there's no energy loss in gas storage. And in a way, the reason petrochemical is so efficient is, in effect, you're not converting the energy, you're generating it as you're using it. So you're not converting, transport, and storing. You're generating the energy and you're using it. Now, it also has waste, and generally has to do with waste heat. And of course, pollution. So the two reasons we want to get rid of petrochemical sourced energy is because the kinds of waste it puts out is detrimental. Heat, we don't want to introduce more heat into the environment, and we certainly don't want to generate more pollution into the environment. And we often talk about pollution with regard to its impact on global warming or global climate change, as we watch California drop under the ocean this week. But the bigger issue with regard to pollution is the fact it's unhealthful. It is tied to cancer, and we haven't got our arms around that particular disease by any stretch of the imagination. So getting off of petrochemical kind of falls into the category of things we should do anyway, even if it didn't have to do with global warming, because it is an unhealthy method of generating power, particularly at scale. It can be problematic, and most of the others, we did have some initial problems with disposing of the blades of the power windmills, power generators, wind-based power generators. That's been solved. It's turned out to be surprisingly easy. And of course, nuclear fuel storage, spent nuclear fuel storage, remains a problem, but the amounts are significantly less than we're talking about in terms of petrochemical emissions. So generally, nuclear is greener than the alternatives, and sometimes you have to look at that greener part. But if nobody wants you to store nuclear material near them and you have no place to store that material, it's still a problem that needs to be solved. You can't say, okay, let's do nuclear, but let's just kind of put off the storage problem, the storage of nuclear waste problem, because it's a very real problem. And a lot of those storage facilities aren't considered very safe, which is also problematic. So part of the issue with doing energy conversion is thinking through the consequential damages and mitigating those damages, not pretending like they don't exist. For instance, as we move to electrical cars, I drive an electric car myself. It's a great way to get people to not be putting out pollution from their automobiles, but it's putting it's increasing pressure on the grids. And when grids are under pressure, they tend to drop back on using relatively inefficient coal and oil-fired generating plants, which in and of themselves are polluting. Now, even using that, the studies have indicated that electric cars are still greener, even looking across the entire ecosystem. They are less green to produce, mostly because of the damn batteries. But over their life cycle, they're greener than polluting cars, and that pollution tends to be centralized, not distributed. So you're not polluting your home per se with this material, which you are doing with petrochemical cars, especially if you fire the damn thing up in your garage and open the garage door, as some people do in the morning, and it's not a good practice. So in the end, the goal we're trying to achieve is a noble one and beneficial, but the way we're going about it is foolish, because we're not focusing on enough on storage. We're not focusing enough on more efficient transport. Almost no work going into efficient transport. Into efficient transport. One of the areas to explore with regard to transport efficiency is looking at PoE. That's power over Ethernet. It's something that Cisco just started pushing pretty heavily in the industrial world, getting away from AC plugs and going to a PoE plug. And it has a couple of benefits. One is you're pushing Ethernet and power across the same cable. Two is the cables tend to be a plug and play. You're not working with bare wires. If any of you have ever done a house rewiring project, and I've done it twice, invariably you're going to have that experience where a breaker was not thrown like it should have been. And of course, I've replaced plugs and switches without turning the power off, and I'm kind of surprised I don't glow in the dark at this point from hitting live wires when I least expect it. The DC power is far safer to work with, and so in the end you can work on DC power with it live with very little risk. Where with AC power you do have that risk of electrocuting yourself if you're not careful, if the breakers don't throw, if you get power, and it's relatively unsafe. We had decades ago there was a video of an elephant being electrocuted. Though the stories surrounding that are mixed, or whether Edison made that happen, or whether the elephant was executed predominantly because it killed a lot of people. I've read both stories; they're interesting. I don't think, but the point that electricity, alternating current electricity, will kill you despite your size was well made. But PoE does allow you, when you're using a solar farm, to get away from that transformer problem, so you don't have to convert the energy to AC and lose a huge amount. And then as you move to smart devices, sensors, and the things we're talking about in terms of smart buildings, smart homes, and smart cities, you're moving the data in a much more secure fashion. Wireless is easy, but it's not particularly secure, because you're broadcasting it out in the world, and even with encryption, people can capture the signal and over time can convert it. Where wired, you have to connect to the physical network generally to pull the signal. You can do it with close proximity, but if you shield the cables, that proximity has to be pretty close. Where if you're broadcasting through the air, it's not secure at all. And the other issue you've got when you're broadcasting in the air, you're surrounding yourself with a lot of broadcast radio wave signals, and they can have an adverse health impact depending on their density. Granted, it's over time and it's very slow, but why take the security risk or health risk? Keep it hardwired, keep it in the wall. And now you can move power and Ethernet around your home, building, or city as one. And those devices can be hooked up securely with a lower security risk, a lower potential health risk. And you're solving two problems at once, and you're leaving the energy in a safer form in DC power than you are with AC. Now, granted, you're still going to have to pull heavy cable for appliances to charge your electric car. But the thing is, even with your electric cars are DC power. You don't have to convert, and so you're taking more of the energy that's being generated and putting it towards propulsion, the automobile, and not wasting so much in converting it between the energy types, between the AC types. So looking at this holistically, there's a way to do this where you get much more yield over a much shorter period of time if you look at the entire problem, which includes both storage and transport. As I mentioned, I think transport is something we could help solve by just by converting a lot of our power from AC to DC, particularly connected to solar plants. But storage, we do not have a good solution yet for storage. And by the way, the problem for storage is the fact we just didn't do much in terms of storage research for decades. Lead acid was good enough, and lithium ion was fine for small devices. And then suddenly we decided to start powering much bigger things with lithium ion, and we discovered lithium ion's not very environmentally friendly to mine or to get rid of. And also, it is nasty when it catches on fire, and much harder to deal with than the old lead acid technology, or even nickel metal hydride, which didn't really have those same kinds of risks or issues, but were far less efficient in terms of storage and being able to dump it. Sadly, our efforts with supercapacitors and ultracapacitors have not really reached the point that we needed them to do. Capacitors will store and release energy with very high efficiency. The issue is they leak. And so they won't store it for long periods of time without that energy leaking out. And so they haven't proven to be the great storage solution that we hoped they would be. They are used in things like long haul semi trucks to allow them to start in cold weather. Cold weather really takes a hit on batteries. Capacitors, apparently not as much. And so batteries with capacitors in them are used to start large trucks and vehicles that have to be out in the cold. It does show promise, and we're working on it, but I have a feeling we're not going to get our arms around the storage problem until we get into next decade. And that means we really need to talk about energy distributed energy generation microgrids as the way to solve both distribution and storage, but really look at energy generation types that are 24/7, which takes out wind and solar, with solar being the easiest. And small scale geothermal is kind of problematic. Even putting in a geothermal air conditioning unit, which I tried to do where I live. Sadly, I'm on top of volcanic rock, and the initial price just to drill the hole to drop the geothermal unit, the geothermal tubes down into, was $80,000, and that's for a home. And that's not even talking about the geothermal plant that you'd have to buy on top of that. So not even remotely affordable. And trying to do microgrid with geothermal would be equally problematic because you have to, the cost of putting in the plant is still too high, even at a small scale. So in the end, we're really struggling with this need for 24/7 power and this disconnect between our most cost-effective energy generation types, which remain solar and wind, and the fact they can't generate 24/7, making storage the big problem on the critical path to making this all work. So we need to solve it. That one part is proven daunting. We need to put far more resources on energy storage to make this effort much more viable than it currently is, and get to the renewable energy that we absolutely need to make the world a much safer place. I mean, even if we get away from pollution and the other problems with regard to petrochemical, if you look at the war in Ukraine, part of that war is exacerbated by the fact that Russia pumps a crap ton of oil, and the rest of Europe is addicted to it. So think of it like it's their drug dealer, and so their ability to move against Russia and suffer through winters where they don't have enough fuel oil has proven to be problematic. And so getting the world off of petrochemical oil, petrochemical sources, has geopolitical benefits as well. So it's important we do this. I just am not convinced we're resourcing the right problems effectively enough, and we need to far more aggressively resource storage than we currently are, storage and transport. So that's where I think I am at this point.
Thank you. Now I request Dr. Tali Raphael.
Okay, I'm not an expert in all of this, but I will say what I want to say regardless of this, because I felt from the presentation of all three of you that you are not for renewable energy. You somehow have your reservations on it. Now, what I want to say is the following. I think that renewable energy is the future, whether we like it or not. It's been growing, whether we like it or not. And this growth is important. Now, what do we do about it? Research, I agree with Rob that we need to concentrate our research on storage and on other matters that have become problematic about this issue, but not to dismiss this thing completely. I come from a region, speaking to you from Jordan. I come from a region in the Middle East where there is plenty of sun and plenty of oil as well. So it's a geopolitical problem to us. I know, I understand that, Rob. And it's something that we as people need to be rallying around. But the sun is for everybody. And the sun is a source of energy that we need to capitalize on. Now, the wind thing, I'm not sure about it, because the wind is not very reliable. And I agree with, I think David is the one that said this, that many birds are dying from these windmills. But solar energy, I think, is a solution that we need to look at more seriously, because the world wants to go into that direction. The world needs to go into that direction, whether we like it or not. That's not something that we could bypass simply by saying that there are technical problems there. Okay, that's what I want to say for the time being. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Sheridan Tasana.
Hello, Sheridan Tasana from San Francisco. I'm not an energy expert, although I've had extensive experience in it. I'm an urban planner, environmental planner by training. In the late 70s, I worked on energy projects for energy independence after the OPEC oil crisis of 1973. We looked at all sources in the United States, nuclear, oil, gas, hydro, solar, wind. I did the solar rights plan for San Bernardino County in 1978. We were going to go all solar. And then, unfortunately, if you study history, oil prices collapsed between 82 to 86, destroyed all oil and gas drilling, all electric vehicles, it wasn't Detroit, all wind and solar, everything collapsed. And Detroit, Houston and Colorado were basically ghost towns during the 80s. And it also fed the cheap energy fueled the Reagan sunshine in America using petrochemicals, right? So that's the history. Now, this time we have still the oil independence concept, which is, over-reliance on places like Russia and the Middle East, which are politically volatile. And we need to get off oil for that reason, because it's politically, we're vulnerable. The difference this time is that oil and gas, the solar and wind prices have dropped substantially, exponentially, and will continue to do that. So that's a big advantage. Last time it was too pricey. So whenever oil prices collapsed, you couldn't compete. Now you could probably compete. If you look at the renewable prices, especially wind power, they tend to come down because exponential growth of production and in your declining cost factor. Whereas oil and gas tends to be volatile up and down, driven heavily by OPEC decisions. So it's already cheaper, for solar than coal, and then eventually for gas, and then eventually cheap oil. So the last standing people will be the Saudi Arabia with $10 per production barrel, whereas Russia's around $60 to $70 to break even. Anyway, that's background. Now, quickly, and I would like to take an urban planning point of view now. And the reason why I say that, we have to think about it strategically, long term. First of all, cities consume 80% of all energy, 80%. All right. So, and they emit maybe 70, 75% of the carbon. Ergo, we will win or lose the energy and the carbon battle in the cities. Now, what's important is the cities are buyers primarily. They don't produce oil in most energy. So they are on the demand side. Currently, all decisions in OPEC are supply side. And so asking suppliers to cut their demand and prices is like asking a drug dealer to cut their sales. You're not going to do it. But you're asking them to slit their throats. It will never happen. I worked with oil and gas. I can tell you, they will never, ever go down to clean the environment, because it's about Wall Street quarterly profits, right? So given that structural change, I think our only chance is a demand side solution. I wrote a book about it, where the cities collaborate and form their own, I hate to say it, cartel, a buyer's cartel. We saw that already a year ago. California, Washington, and Oregon said, we're getting all these high prices. So what they did is they got together, formed a buyer's cartel, literally, to buy in bulk, because you with a larger population, you have more negotiating clout with all the different suppliers. So I think in the future, we're going to see huge regional buyer cartels, cities and states even, and nations, determining prices. And they're going to bid, and so all the suppliers will have to bid for their business. And so I think, and then the good part about cities is they're closer to the citizens, because it's easier to vote out a mayor than it is a national leader. And you can vote on city council. So I think we're going to see a shift over the next generation that I've given up, frankly, on a supply side solution in terms of voluntary cutbacks. I think on the supply side, it would be more technical innovation, right? And then on the demand side, that's where the power will rely, because they can basically determine pricing by forming a cartel. Now, on a micro level, if I look at it in terms of flow, so I look at materials, production, storage, transmission, and then use. On urban planning, I tend to look more on the use side. So it gets down to energy efficiency, so short term. The simplest way to reduce your all energy use, as well, which is right now 80% petrochemicals, is pricing, demand shifting. So you price things high during peak hours to reduce it and push it to other times when it's cheap. So for example, you price things high in the evenings to reduce, so people put on their let's say dishwasher or washing machines in the middle of the night when energy is cheap. So there's a lot of demand shifting that you can do through pricing incentives at the local level. The other one is insulation. Cities, buildings basically use about 40% of energy, and they're very inefficient. The easiest is new buildings, because you start from scratch, you put in better insulation and passive design. The harder part is the older buildings. That's what 98% of the buildings in the world. How do you insulate? That's the tricky one. I mean, people are doing shells now. So instead of trying to tear out the walls, you just put overlay onto the existing walls and create a new second layer skin over the buildings and seal up the building. So I think we're going to see, and then what's good about insulation is it creates millions and millions of jobs for finance people, construction, materials. But I think we're going to see huge innovation, insulation technologies. Some of it prefab, so they might rip out a wall and just drop in a prefab wall. And so it'll be factory type of production for that. We will also see, we'll see competitive bidding. It's a little bit like the buyer's cartel. I spoke to the city of Palo Alto, and I said, how do you deal? Because your average population is 7 years old. And he said, well, we tried and gave up on solar. Because when you're 70 to 80 years old, why would you take out a 20-year loan when you're going to be gone? So they got almost no adoption. And I said, what are you going to do? And he goes, oh, simple. We did competitive bidding. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, we bought on the city on behalf of all residents and businesses in Palo Alto. And we had bidding with all the solar community grids, because we only bought renewables. And so we got the best price, really cheap. And if we don't like them, we have backup. In fact, they have multiple, wind, different suppliers in the grid, and they will use competitive bidding to get the lowest prices. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation there in governments collaborating to get the cheapest prices, buying in cartels, consortiums. And that's where the smart grids are going to come in, because Silicon Valley loves to develop systems where you can do that easily. So right now it's hard. But imagine if you could say anytime, Cupertino, Palo Alto, San Francisco could immediately develop a buyer's group and bid real time on any pricing anywhere in the Bay Area or in the state. But we don't have that right now. It's a kind of a dumb system that's rigid. So we'll see a lot more flexible, smart grids that are AI driven, and then also I hate to say cartel driven. Then the other problem we have is urban design. So California fell into the trap of decarbonizing by going to natural gas over the last, and PG&E loves that. So we're stuck with a lot of natural gas. So many of California is trying to electrify, but then when you just put in natural gas, nobody wants to tear it out. So often the red states and the East Coast states are much faster in electrifying because they didn't fall into the trap of natural gas that California fell into several years ago. So I think the opportunity there, how do you electrify? And that's a tricky question, because it's like doing insulation. You have to ask landlords and people to tear out and literally put $10,000 to $20,000 in. It's not going to happen. Most poor families can't afford it. So I think that's going to be a big challenge, is how do you get off of natural gas? Now, the other areas I think are interesting, I did look at this geothermal, the subsoil, the shallow one, but as Rob said, it's really expensive per housing units. So I don't. It's like California. It's like solar panels. Don't expect individual homeowners to do it. I think the city should take the lead, and then say we will build a city or community geothermal, subsoil, shallow, and then we'll do a municipal bond to finance it. And then we'll just share the cost across the board, and then reduce, and then produce energy at a community or preferably a city level, because it's trouble at community level. It's only the rich communities that can afford it. So you want to do it through the whole city. So the rich basically subsidize the poor much more. And I think that's a fair way to go. Is there anything else? Of course, the big boom right now is heat pumps. That's popular. But again, that also requires income, because many poor families won't have it, and then the landlords don't want to pay for it. So again, you need some sort of subsidies and things to get landlords as well as the poor families to adopt it. So I think, so a lot of this stuff is I call block and tackling at the local level. The good part about it, though, is that during this recession, there's going to be a lot of unemployed people, and so local decentralized solutions create tens of millions of jobs. Whereas the problem with centralized one, I can tell you, I worked at Bechtel. You only, we used to say Saudi Arabia is the worst place in the world for energy because it's highly capital intensive. You have a lot of engineering elites, and nobody else has jobs. That's the problem with that petrochemical, highly centralized solution, as well as solar. Whereas if you have decentralized solutions, you create lots of jobs in local communities for local solutions, and then it requires more creative thinking at the local level, not just a top-down centralized solution. And the other problem, obviously, in centralized solution, it politically and financially, it takes forever to get those things up. I mean, we built power plants. It could take 10 to 20 years to get the approval behind these things and build it out. So the development time for these big projects is decades, not years, right? So whereas local solutions can happen literally in a year or two if you do it right. Very quick, small modular solutions. And I think that's where we really need to go, is tap in the brains. We call them local citizens and scientists, of people who are there really smart and creative, and then who come up with solutions locally. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ron.
Thank you. My computer's a little laggy, so please let me know if there's any difficulties hearing me. I think that it's very important for us to look at this in a global perspective. And a lot of the perceptions of renewable energy are predicated on an urban first world perspective, in that we want to see our future preserved and maintained in the same fashion as what we have now. My perspective is that we'll be damn lucky to have a society at all, given the impacts of climate change, such that anything that we do right now to preserve at least a modicum of civilization is much more important than to insist that everybody drives a car. There's a verse in the Bible that says that if much has been given to you, much is expected of you. And I think that we have all been given a great deal of value from Mother Earth, and it's now time for us to return that value by being perceptive and knowing how to apply the tools that we have. There's a lot of talk here about how expensive renewable energy is. In bad times, I'd much rather have a $100 solar panel than a tank of $5 per gallon gasoline. Of course, I speak in American terms here, but the same thing applies whether it's a liter or a gallon. The small amount of solar can be very effective. And if you don't think you can afford enough solar for your home, and the time $50,000, you can buy consumer products for a light for $10-$20, and you can buy a standby system for a couple $100. So solar entry is very low. You don't need a comprehensive system to run everything under all circumstances. And I'd like to start here by explaining that my primary role, getting back 50 years, is to find a way to use solar for transportation. Several of you have pointed out how awkward our transportation system is, not the least of which is if you have an electric car, it's still a car. And in urban planning context, it's something which uses more space. One car uses more space than a human at the end of the day. So I want to show you something here that I discovered many years ago. And let's see if I can bring up the present button. Oh, there we go. Here. My computer's acting up. Just at the wrong time. Oh, well. So much for that idea. What we have is that I created a anomaly, a club. I call it the X2M Club. And those are the countries which went from export to import of oil. And the one that started the whole club was the American importing of oil that began in the late 1940s after the Second World War. And then there was a big excitement. It turns out that in the 80s period, which we call Reaganomics, we had 4 areas of the world where oil became very plentiful. One was the UK and Norway with the North Sea, the North Slopes in Alaska. Mexico began production and selling to outsiders. And then finally it was China. So China learned how to deal oil from the sea, and they had a run which ended in 1993. Then the UK became a net importer again after a big gush in the 80s with the North Sea to the late 1990s. And then in 2003, Indonesia became a net importer. The one that's most critical in terms of our understanding, I think, is Syria. They had a collapse of their oil industry just at the time that a drought formed in eastern Syria. And as a consequence of that, instead of helping them with energy, we decided to bomb their cities, we collectively with the Russians. So we must understand that there's another way of addressing this, and we must understand that we don't only have a climate crisis, we also have an energy crisis, in that we're coming to the time when one after another, countries that we were depending upon for oil are going to be marginalized, and their income that they had for many decades goes away, and then these countries are in very serious difficulties. So what my team has done is to create a system of transportation based on solar canopies on top of the streets. And you'll see a couple of examples of these with a bicycle path in a city along a highway in Germany. So what we're doing is we're creating a canopy that goes over the street and takes the energy from sunshine and moves it directly to the stations that are very close together and ubiquitous around the city. And then from that step, we are able to store energy into the vehicles on a much smaller basis than you would have with a with an automobile, electric car. In other words, you can charge for 10 or 20 kilometers and then recharge at a station. And the stations very close together are storing energy. And these energy sources do not have to be large. I mean, the storage systems don't have to be large, and they're highly distributed. And we don't have to put solar energy out in the desert. And furthermore, we can be confident that the amount of storage we require is small, because when is transportation used? Well, that would be during the day. So during the prime times when we need transportation, we have energy at its maximum, with a little exception that later in the day, there's a certain amount of solar that is required, so that can be storage. So in other words, if you store energy for an electric car, you have to store it all night and use it all day. With our system, you only need about 3 hours of storage. So your battery's requirement is again much lower than it would be in the case of an electric vehicle. And if I don't know if I can show this. Like I said, my screen is. Oh, here we go. Oh, no, lost it again. Sorry about the technical difficulties here. Can you? There. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
No, not yet. I can't see it.
Can anybody see it?
Yes, now we can see it. Welcome
Okay.
to Spartan.
Yeah, welcome to Spartan
Superway.
Superway. So here's an illustration of this system. You see that you have cars suspended from a track, and there's a solar canopy, and in the distance there you see the canopy over the station. So at each station, in addition to having solar there, you have a battery system down in the ground. It doesn't have to be exotic, high-cost lithium batteries, but a lot of companies are working on very low cost. They're heavy, but since they're on the ground and not moving, that's not a problem. So we have a small, lightweight battery pack in each of the cars, which you can see suspended there, and it goes like that. So I think that's enough for now, just to get the ball rolling. I have some other thoughts, but I definitely do not see storage as a challenge, as long as we rearrange the way we do things and we don't expect to drag our artifacts of the fossil fuel era, such as the automobile, kicking and screaming into the post-carbon world. Thank you. Oh, maybe I could show you this now. There's the countries that went into importing status, and each one of the companies so affected has been damaged greatly by this. But I'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. David Smith, what's your concluding remarks for this session?
Sharif and all the other panelists, thank you. I think we've come up with a lot of interesting ideas and statistics and other elements. Renewable energy can be part of the mix to solve all the global energy challenges, but it's going to be a mix. It's going to be hybrid solutions, and with different ones. Rob talked about capacitors and ultra capacitors and things. I personally believe those have to be part of the mix as you look at different elements. Energy storage, huge one. Rob talked about the genetic energy which you can get out of railroads. His example was the train coming down the mountain. I saw another startup recently in Florida who has engineered special cars to go on trains with batteries and things on them to take low-level energy from each of the train wheels without increasing friction to generate powers, and you just drop the cars off at cities and put new ones on there and plug into the grid. So there's a lot of different innovation ideas being used. But I would just like to finish with going back to another concept that we talked about earlier. And Dr. Talib, I actually think this, even in Jordan and places like that where you have a lot of sun and you have a lot of petroleum and things, have an appropriate place. And it's really going back to what we've talked about earlier about microgrids, because I think microgrids and point of use power generation will go a long ways to helping us declare energy independence, because it lets us rethink power transmission. It lets us rethink more of what the environmental responsibility are going to be. And it lets people see more the impact of what they're doing. One of my big takeaways on this is that Dr. Talib often makes the point that the average citizens do not understand the impact of the needs for climate change and what's happening there. But I think when you have average citizens working in communities where the microgrids and the mini grids are directly supplying power to where they live, where they work, you'll see more of that average citizen understanding the impacts more. And I believe that the microgrids are going to be a real part of it. Also, microgrids add resiliency. You know, we've seen in the war in Ukraine that there is a lot of emphasis where the power grids are being knocked down. Microgrids, mini grids, again, help in times of natural disaster and war become more of that. Also, systems that incorporate microgrids can allow more efficient energy transmission than traditional grids alone. So you see that offering an alternative there, particularly when you use renewable resources such as solar, biomass, wind, local hydro, local wave, and others to solve those mini grids and microgrids. One of the big challenges with renewable energy is not the generation, but the transmission and the control of them. And what we've seen is that the microgrids cut down and eliminate a lot of the transmission, and the control systems are easier to use. And the control systems are one that can respond to the local conditions more than after a larger region, which you see with traditional grids. And for populations in remote areas outside of the larger cities, microgrids really let those areas become more expanded access to cleaner electricity. And they can come from multiple places there. And, you know, there's places where there's not enough renewable energy, you can see conventional approaches take there too. You know, a great example is if I go and look in where the Dutch have proposed the quadrupling of microgrids by 2030. And they've proposed implementing as a basis for what they call smart integrated decentralized energy systems. And I particularly think this is an approach that, as I look around developed and developing nations, what the Dutch are doing is a great example to see how we can begin to bring the concept of renewable energy down to where the average person can understand it, they can relate to it, and they begin to see how they have a role in solving climate change. And I think microgrids with all these renewable technologies will also form part of that education piece that is missing, that we've talked about on prior shows before, to solve these problems. So Sharif, that's my concluding remarks.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I'm not against renewable energy. I'm pro renewable energy. You can tell I've got a solar plant on my house. I'm putting in the batteries, and I've got an electric car, 2 electric cars actually. So the difficulty is, though, as we go down this path of renewable energy, we're not thinking through all the aspects of it equally, and it's not something that's multiple choice. You have to do everything to get it done right. And part of that is storage and transport, and it does play into how you distribute the power and how you store it when it's not being generated. There are certainly existing workarounds, but the overall effort seems to me, unfortunately, very politically guided. It's and not being guided by science. And when you're doing an energy conversion, science should dictate the mode and the means. For instance, in California, they should be heavily invested in wave power. Much more efficient. Proximity is there. It goes up and down the coast. That would probably be a much lower cost and less politically troubling path than nuclear power would be for them, because they've got all that ocean. On the other hand, you get to the middle part of the United States. There's really nothing better than nuclear, but the issue with nuclear is it would have to be centralized and then distributed, so we need to get the plants down in size, so we make up for that transport loss, and we seriously have to look at nuclear disposal and waste. But if we do those things, we can make this happen. If we don't, it's going to be this Helen Valley thing that we've talked about before, where the one government entity invests like hell in renewable energy, and the next people that come into power say, screw that, we're going to go back to petrochemical, and we just can't afford these hills and valleys. So my point is, science should dictate. It needs to be a holistic approach where we look at the entire problem and focus on fixing the underlying issue. And the underlying issue is that we've got to get off petrochemical power. It's from a political, economic, environmental aspect. This petrochemical power just is not sustainable. And so moving off it into something better is on the critical path to making a better planet. But we can only do it if we do it right, and we have to do it holistically to do it right.
Thank you.
I'll leave your mute.
Dr. What's your concluding remarks?
Me? You're talking to me?
Dr. Tali.
Sheridan?
Yeah.
Okay. What I want to say is I'm very happy with what David and Don have said now, because I think that it's important to look at this in a realistic way and to understand that the future is going to be solar energy, whether we like it or not. Now, solar energy is not because it solves the environmental problem, not in our part of the world. It's because it reduces the prices of energy. Now, in Jordan, for example, the price of alcohol, the price of energy is very high. I had put solar panels in my home because my energy bill, my electricity bill was so high. Now I'm enjoying the benefits of solar energy. So microgrids, as David said, are very important in this regard. I think microgrid is a solution because you don't have to worry much about many of the things that the professor talked about. Now, what do we do in this regard? I think what we need to do is we need to ensure that the science is working in our favor, that the science is doing what we want it to do. It improves the storage of the energy. It improves the transport of the energy. And it improves the manufacturing of the panels, because the manufacturing of the panels is expensive, and it is also costly in terms of what do you do. You're using solar energy to produce these panels. You're not using solar energy to produce these panels, unfortunately. So we need to work on that. I am also very much with Professor Sheldon. I hope I've pronounced your name right, Professor. Because if you concentrate on cities, for example, now, cities are very important. I'm an urban designer myself. I'm an architect and an urban designer. And I know how important cities are. And as you said, 70-75% of carbon emission comes out of cities. So if we don't concentrate on cities, we will be losing so much of opportunities, because it's one locality, one area concentrated with people. So that's something that we need to look at more carefully. And the new buildings that are being designed now ought to be really very sensitive towards the environment. And ought to be very sensitive towards solar energy. Skyscraper is not a problem anymore. It's how you build it and where you build it. How you build it, you need to distinguish between a skyscraper that's a solar collector and a skyscraper that is a solar consumer, really. So, and it could be a vertical garden as well. So, skyscraper now is an opportunity that we must grab. And I think more energy, more efforts should be put into that. That's what I want to say for the time being. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. So it was a very important session and a very educational session.
Thank you.
You're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tali Raphael. Thank you, Mr. David Smith, for your continuous support for World Talent Economic Forum. You know, from this dialogue, whatever we learn, especially the emerging economy, and we love to execute this knowledge. And hopefully, your contribution can change a lot of human beings' life. Thank you. Bye bye, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you.